Have you ever stopped to wonder if the world around you hasn't quietly gone mad? I'm not just talking about the neighbor muttering to himself on the sidewalk. Not just the politician turning lies into promises. Not just the influencer performing a life that never existed. I'm talking about the structure of society itself, the machinery of culture, the beliefs, the thoughts, all moving together like sleepwalkers in the dark. We're taught to see madness as something individual. A chemical imbalance. A broken brain. A fragile soul that couldn't handle reality. We imagine the insane as the exception, the outlier, the lost sheep outside the flock. But what if it's the other way around? What if madness isn't the individual breaking from society, but society itself breaking into the individual? History whispers a disturbing truth. Collective insanity is not rare. Entire crowds burned women alive, convinced they were witches. Nations marched to war believing they were liberating the world, when in fact they drowned it in blood. Families denounced neighbors not out of personal hatred but because everyone else was doing it. Carl Jung wrote, "The greatest danger to humanity does not come from nature, nor from machines but from the psyche, the collective psyche." He understood that when fear, desire, and trauma ripple through the masses, they create something larger than ourselves. Something irrational yet persuasive. Something destructive yet seductive. And here lies the paradox. The more people share the same illusion, the truer it seems. The madness of one person is called psychosis. The madness of millions is called culture. Look around you. Don't you feel it? The constant noise of opinions, outrage, distractions. The way trends rise and collapse like waves, sweeping everyone along. The way entire groups come to believe, without evidence, that their path is the only path, and anyone outside must be silenced. Isn't there something almost pathological about the way we live? But collective psychosis doesn't show up with wild eyes and hysterical screams. It wears the costume of normality. It hides in advertising slogans, political speeches, viral hashtags, self-help mantras. It looks so ordinary, so acceptable, that questioning it feels strange. Kierkegaard said, "The crowd is a lie." To dissolve into the crowd is to abandon the responsibility of thought, of conscience, of authentic existence. And yet, isn't it so much easier to dissolve? To agree, to repeat, to belong, than to stand alone and say, "Something here is wrong." Mass psychosis feeds on that comfort. It grows in the fear of exclusion, in the hunger for certainty, in the exhaustion of doubt. And when it takes hold, it becomes almost invisible, because when everyone goes mad together, sanity itself begins to look like madness. The question is no longer, are there insane individuals among us? The question is, has the world we live in already gone mad? This series of reflections will dive into that unsettling possibility. We'll explore what psychologists call mass psychosis, the phenomenon where entire populations lose touch with reality. We'll revisit history's darkest moments, where hysteria spread like wildfire. We'll dissect the modern world, its technology, its culture of distraction, its politics of fear. And we'll ask, how does this collective sickness seep into our lives, shaping our anxieties, our relationships, our very sense of self? And above all, we'll ask, is there a way out? Because if society is sick, then every attempt to remain sane becomes an act of rebellion. In this video, we will plunge into one of the most disturbing phenomena of the human condition: mass psychosis. How can entire societies lose touch with reality? How do fear, insecurity, and the need to belong turn millions of people into accomplices of the same collective illusion? We'll journey through history, philosophy, and psychology to understand how madness can cease to be individual and become cultural, silent, invisible, and yet devastating. If you're intrigued by this topic and enjoying the video, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support and keep bringing content like this. When we hear the word psychosis, we usually think of isolated individuals. A patient in a psychiatric hospital, someone who has lost touch with reality, who hears voices, who sees what isn't there. But mass psychosis is something different. and in many ways far more frightening. Because it's not a single mind disconnecting from reality, but thousands, even millions of minds sinking around the same illusion. Psychologists describe this phenomenon as a collective loss of contact with reality. A shared hysteria where the line between true and false dissolves, and what remains is a common narrative, believed with fervor, defended as if life or death depended on it. What defines this condition isn't merely a misperception, but the passionate conviction of being right, and the hostility toward anyone who dares to doubt. Carl Jung saw this danger with striking clarity. For him, the human mind is not just individual. There exists a collective unconscious, an invisible field where symbols, fears, and impulses spill from one person to another, almost contagiously. In that space, madness doesn't need to originate within a single individual. It can emerge in the group, in the crowd, and then be absorbed as intimate truth by each member. In this sense, Jung warned, the greatest danger is not earthquakes, floods, or machines, but the collective psyche. Gabor Mate, a contemporary physician and thinker, adds a crucial layer to this reflection. The idea that much of our compulsions, addictions, and suffering don't stem solely from individual choices, but from unresolved collective traumas. A traumatized society produces sick individuals. And a mass of wounded, disoriented, and meaning-hungry people is the perfect soil for the spread of a collective psychosis. But how does it happen in practice? Almost always there's a trigger, a crisis, a diffuse fear and anxiety that sweeps through an entire community. It could be a real or imagined threat, economic instability, an external enemy, a new technology, a natural disaster. This collective fear needs a narrative to make sense of it, and that's when ideologies, conspiracies, and dogmas emerge, ways to organize chaos into a story that can be understood. And suddenly it's not just about believing, it's about belonging. If you repeat the dominant narrative, you are welcomed. If you question it, you are rejected. Mass psychosis is sustained not only by conviction but by the fear of exclusion. It is loneliness that sickens more than the lie. Think about how this shows up today, when millions believe the same false news, when entire groups are swept up by waves of outrage on social media, when people become incapable of dialogue outside their bubble. It's not individuals going mad alone, but a collective choreography of the mind. Mass psychosis is dangerous precisely because it seems rational. From the inside, it doesn't sound like madness, it sounds like absolute certainty. And the more people believe it, the harder it is to see that it's a delusion. And here arises an uncomfortable question. Could what we call normalcy today already be, in itself, a form of collective psychosis? For many, the idea that an entire society could go mad seems exaggerated, almost conspiratorial. But history not only confirms this possibility, it repeats it in different forms as if it were an inevitable pattern of humanity. At the end of the Middle Ages, entire villages fell into collective hysteria over the fear of witches. Thousands of women were burned alive, accused of dark practices without any real evidence. It wasn't just religious fanaticism. It was fear amplified by economic insecurity, ignorance, and the power of institutions. A fear that found a convenient target, female bodies onto which invisible evil was projected. For those inside that society, participating in these hunts seemed natural, even virtuous. Only today, looking from the outside, do we recognize the delirium. Move forward a few centuries and we see the same dynamics in other forms. Nazi Germany, for instance, wasn't built solely by authoritarian leaders, but by millions of ordinary citizens who embraced a narrative of purity, identity, and fear. Collective delusion didn't begin in the concentration camps. It began in neighborhood conversations, in schools and newspapers, in the desire for belonging and national pride. Psychosis seeped into everyday gestures until it became a deadly machine. Kierkegaard, even in the 19th century, had already identified this risk when he wrote, "The crowd is a lie." For him, truth is never found in the masses, but in the individual who has the courage to stand alone before themselves. The crowd dilutes responsibility, dissolves consciousness. In collective hysteria, no one feels guilty, everyone simply goes with the flow, and it is precisely for this reason that evil spreads so easily. Another example. Consider the religious and messianic fervors that swept entire populations into destructive cults. In Jonestown, in 1978, over 900 people died in a mass suicide, convinced they were fulfilling a higher purpose. They weren't all clinically insane. They were ordinary individuals, led to believe that blind obedience was the path to salvation. The pattern repeats, a crisis awakens fear. Fear demands an explanation. The explanation comes in the form of a narrative, and the narrative demands adherence. Before long, what began as doubt transforms into dogma. Collective psychosis is born not from a lack of reason, but from its surrender to a story that feels more bearable than uncertainty. And if we look closely, we realize that hysteria doesn't need to be violent to be devastating. Often, collective madness manifests in subtler forms. In the idolization of blind progress, the worship of productivity, unrestrained consumerism. These are less bloody delusions, yet they slowly erode the collective soul, like a shared addiction no one notices. The question then isn't whether societies can go mad, but when it will happen again. Across different times and places, we've already seen this play performed countless times. And perhaps we are now living a new version of it. It's tempting to believe that mass psychosis belongs only to the past, to medieval bonfires, world wars, totalitarian regimes. But the truth is, it has only changed its face. Today it wears the mask of modernity. We live in an age where collective hysteria no longer spreads only in public squares, but through screens. Social media is, in many ways, the perfect stage for mass psychosis. There, the collective unconscious meets a technology capable of accelerating contagion. A lie spreads faster than any truth. Viral outrage can ignite millions in mere hours. And suddenly, fleeting opinions become dogma, hashtags turn into courts of judgment, and silence is treated as a crime. Zygmunt Bauman described our era as liquid modernity, a time when nothing is solid, when everything slips through our hands before we can grasp it. This liquidity doesn't show up only in fragile relationships or precarious work. It also manifests in truth. What is true today is replaced by another narrative tomorrow. We live in a constant state of disorientation, and it is precisely this instability that paves the way for collective delusion. After all, when nothing is firm, any convincing story seems better than emptiness. But contemporary psychosis isn't limited to information. It also expresses itself in the way we live. Consider the cult of productivity, an entire society convinced that human worth can be measured in metrics, numbers, reports, likes. Exhausted, anxious, depressed people, yet unable to stop, because the collective delusion says that resting is failure, and those who don't produce don't deserve to exist. Or consider consumerism, a silent psychosis that convinces us that the next purchase, the next experience, the next tech upgrade will finally bring the meaning we lack. Every day, millions go into debt, feel frustrated, become alienated, and yet keep believing that next time will be different. Isn't that how delusions work? A promise that never comes true, yet continues to seduce us. What's most unsettling is that all of this presents itself as normal. No one points to social media addiction, compulsive consumption, or collective anxiety as symptoms of a cultural psychosis. On the contrary, we call it progress, the market, modern lifestyle. Insanity hides behind respectable words. And the price of this modern madness is high. We live in a society saturated with information yet starving for wisdom. Surrounded by virtual friends, but increasingly isolated. Connected all the time, yet profoundly disconnected from ourselves. The paradox is cruel. The more we try to integrate into collective psychosis, the further we drift from any true sanity. Mass psychosis in the modern world doesn't need concentration camps to be devastating. It erodes slowly. It sickens the body with chronic stress, the mind with anxiety, the soul with existential emptiness. It's an invisible prison without walls, where people lock themselves involuntarily because they believe there is nothing outside. And perhaps that's precisely why it's so hard to fight. Because when insanity wears the clothing of normality, anyone who dares to question it risks being called crazy. So far, we've talked about crowds, entire societies, collective narratives. But mass psychosis isn't just a phenomenon out there. It breathes within each individual. It shapes the way we think, feel, and even relate to ourselves. When insanity becomes social norm, resisting it is a burden few can bear. The price of sanity in a sick culture is loneliness, is feeling out of place, strange, outside the game. It's no wonder so many choose to surrender. It's less painful to repeat the shared lie than to uphold the truth in isolation. This psychological weight manifests in symptoms we know well: the constant anxiety of never being enough, the silent depression of those who feel life has lost meaning, the latent aggression of someone living in a state of constant alert. The individual absorbs the sickness of the crowd, and the collective emptiness becomes personal emptiness. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps, said that the greatest suffering of the human being is not physical pain or material loss, but existential emptiness, the feeling that life has no purpose. When this emptiness spreads across an entire society, it becomes fuel for mass psychosis. People deprived of meaning cling to any narrative, any cause, any delusion that offers a sense of belonging. And here lies the irony. Collective psychosis promises to relieve loneliness, but it only deepens it. Consider how this happens today. On social media, millions gather in thought bubbles, where everyone repeats the same ideas, where everyone applauds the same beliefs. At first glance, it seems like connection. But in practice, it's only echo. No one truly listens, no one dialogues. The mind closes itself into a resonating box, and paradoxically, the more people share that box, the lonelier each individual feels. Carl Jung called this process the disintegration of the psyche, when the individual loses touch with their essence, dissolving into the mass. The danger is that, in this state, we are no longer masters of our own emotions. Collective fear becomes our fear. Collective anger becomes our anger. Collective desire becomes our desire. And little by little, we stop living as subjects and start living as reflections. This emptiness has profound consequences. It explains why so many today live in a state of constant fatigue, even without an apparent reason. Why so many young people describe life as meaningless. Why diagnoses of depression and anxiety are rising at epidemic levels. We are falling ill together, not just biologically but psychologically. And perhaps this is where the phenomenon of mass psychosis becomes most cruel. It doesn't need to imprison the body. It only needs to imprison the mind. When we accept the collective lie as truth, visible chains are unnecessary. We chain ourselves willingly. The question that remains is, how to resist? How to maintain lucidity amid shared delusion? How not to lose oneself when everything around seems to demand surrender? This is where the next step comes in, exploring how individual consciousness can become an antidote to collective insanity. Faced with all this, the inevitable question arises, is there a way out? If entire societies can go mad, if culture can become an invisible prison, how can one remain lucid amidst collective delirium? Nietzsche, in his fierce critique of morality in mass culture, said that man must become a free spirit. Not in the superficial sense of doing whatever he wants, but in the profound sense of being able to think for oneself, even if it means walking against the current. For Nietzsche, the greatest danger wasn't individual insanity, but the conformity that suffocates singularity. To resist mass psychosis is, above all, to have the courage to bear the loneliness of lucidity. Carl Jung pointed in the same direction when he spoke of the process of individuation. He believed that every human carries within them a unique potential for consciousness, but that this potential only flourishes when we differentiate ourselves from the mass. For him, there is no collective healing without individual transformation. Society only becomes healthy when individuals decide to confront their own shadows, instead of projecting them onto others. This means that resistance isn't made of grand heroic gestures, but of small acts of awareness. Questioning a dominant belief, refusing to repeat an empty discourse, choosing silence over noise, finding meaning not in the applause of the crowd, but in something more intimate, more true. Viktor Frankl, having survived the hell of the concentration camps, realized that the ultimate human freedom is the freedom to choose one's own attitude in the face of circumstances. Even when everything around seems to be going mad, we still have the power to say, I will not lose myself. Perhaps this is the deepest form of resistance. Of course, living in a sick world is not easy. It's uncomfortable. It's lonely. Often it feels futile. But perhaps true madness is believing that the only way to survive is to merge with collective insanity. Perhaps sanity is always a minority, always silent, always uncomfortable. And here we arrive at the final paradox. Mass psychosis is only powerful because it convinces us that being alone is unbearable. But if we accept solitude as an inevitable part of lucidity, perhaps we discover that we are not so alone after all. In every era, there have always been those who dared to see beyond the collective illusion. And it is thanks to them that humanity has not been entirely lost. So how do we resist? There is no ready-made formula. But perhaps it begins like this. With the courage to think. With the humility to doubt. With the strength to remain whole, even when fragmented inside. Perhaps the only way not to go mad along with the world is the courage to stay sane even in solitude. If this video touched you in some way, it may be because part of you already knew this and just needed to hear it aloud. Subscribe to The Human Paradox and walk with us on this journey. Because questioning the madness of the world is the first step to not losing yourself within it.